So I've been on a nostalgia kick lately, and I've been going back and checking out some gaming magazines from the days when I used to buy magazines. And I'm not sure how many people younger than maybe 25 remember gaming magazines because I know they are not a thing anymore. I know that there are a few publications that still exist to this day, but they are more of a niche thing rather than the norm like it used to be back in the day. And but if you're over 30, you probably grew up on gaming magazines. That was the main source of information that we had available to us back in the day. And Brazil was kind of an interesting thing. I was born and raised in Brazil, and Brazil was kind of an interesting thing during that era because we used to get things pretty late back then. Consoles, game releases, and to some extent, news as well. And I remember that, and this is something that I only became aware of in retrospect. Back in the day, we had no idea that this was a thing, but I remember that in going back and checking some news in regards to latest releases and stuff like that, we would always be late to the party for some reason. I don't know if there was some sort of an issue in regards to translation or access to information. I don't know what that was, but it was kind of an interesting time because video game consoles, for example, would take sometimes years to be available in Brazil. And even still, they would cost an arm and a leg, so most of us wouldn't be able to afford it on day one. So the only way that we could actually keep up with gaming was through magazines. And for me personally, that was a way for me to kind of daydream about my next console, and I would use that as a way to kind of convince my parents that they should give me a brand new console as soon as they could afford one. But I just grabbed this EGM issue. I got it randomly because it has Gran Turismo on the cover. I never read it, but I remember this being one of my favorite, if not my favorite, gaming magazine in Brazil. We got it pretty late. I saw issues dating. I saw issues going back to in the 90s for the DGM magazine in the US, but I remember that in Brazil we only started getting this magazine published in Brazilian Portuguese around 2002, 2004, something like that. So it was pretty late. And one of the things that I actually enjoyed about it is that I don't know if it was a thing in the US, but in Brazil, magazines tend to go for humor. I don't know why there was a thing, but um, most gaming magazines that were published during that time, they always cracked jokes, puns, and some of them even had characters like original characters that represented the magazines. And the EGM was, I think, the first magazine that I saw, or one of the first magazines that I saw back in the day, that didn't have any of that. They were very straight to the point, very professional, very serious publication. And I don't know, I actually enjoy that style of publication more than the quirky magazines that we used to have in Brazil. And it was filled to the brim with info. That the information that they had in their publications were a lot more detailed, and they went a lot more in depth. And for that reason, the 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 magazines was always like almost twice the thickness of a regular magazine that was published at the time. So I really enjoyed that. So there was a lot to unpack, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this, but these days, I don't think that you can get the same feeling. There was a certain magic back in the day that, and I know I sound like an old man, but there was a certain magic back in the day regarding magazines, because these days we get access to information pretty much instantly. We get access to new trailers, to new announcements, new releases, reviews, and even leaks to some extent. And back in the day, at least in Brazil, internet access was a lot more limited than other parts of the world. But in Brazil, the only way that we could get our hands into the latest information regarding gaming was through magazines. So there was a month-long anticipation for the next issue, and we had no idea what to expect from that next issue. We didn't know what games were going to be featured. We didn't know what games were going to be reviewed. We didn't know what games we would see have we would see walkthroughs for. So it was, at least for me, it was like Christmas every month. Like I really looked forward to going to the newsstand. Magazines in Brazil used to be sold at newsstands, and see what the latest issue of my favorite gaming magazine would have articles on. But anyways, let's check this issue of EGM and see if it brings back some memories of games that I used to play back in the day. And I got the this issue with the Gran Turismo 3 on the cover, and it's kind of ironic because I pretty much skipped over most of the PS2 era. That's a, let me see. Yeah, it's still recording. So that's a story for another video. But yeah, I skipped over almost the entirety of the PS2 generation. I love the I love the ads, the old style ads from back in the day. I don't know if this is a knock on Sega with the Dreamcast. I don't know if Dreamcast was out back then, but this looks very similar to a Dreamcast logo. But I don't think it. Yeah, I think it's more about the game because there is a screenshot, the third one at the bottom, that has the exact same target. I don't know. Star Wars Starfighter. Unreal Tournament, I remember this was a huge deal back in the day. And I saw it being talked about in a lot of magazines. Um, Alone in the Dark, the new Nightmare. I had this game on the PS1, scared the shit out of me, and that's something that it's still the same to this day. Like I enjoy horror games, but I'm a chicken for horror games. I've always been a chicken, but the older I get, uh, the less I'm able to play through them. When I was younger, even though I would shit my pants, I would still be able to play through at least some of them. And Alone in the Dark wasn't one of them. This game scared the crap out of me. That's for sure. Wing Back. I thought this was a Nintendo 64 exclusive, but apparently there was a PS2 version too. Virtua Fighter at the top. Space Channel. Okay, there's something here that caught my eye. PS-DOF. Retailers, publishers, and developers all have problems with the PS2, but you won't hear them say that. Gamers who waited in lines for hours at the PS2 launch, only to turn up one, only to turn. I'm not a native English speaker, but this sounds like a weird way to phrase it. Let me start over. Gamers who waited in lines for hours at the PS2 launch only to wind up empty-handed aren't the only ones unhappy with Sony. Despite plenty of public praise over the PS2, privately we have been hearing rumblings from developers and publishers about many aspects of Sony's new machine. The one complaint with Sony's new system many are anxious to vent about, even on the record, is the challenge of developing for the PS2. That's true. I've heard that's something that I've heard from many people over the years, is that the PS2 wasn't an easy machine to develop for. Uh, but that's ironic because that's still regarded to this day as one of the best consoles to ever exist, and the library on that on this console is ridiculous, which is one of the things that I kind of regret about skipping over the PS2 era. Wasn't by choice, but that's still something I regret. And even to this day, I look back on the library. When I used to live in Japan, I used to see these games being sold at used stores, and part of me wanted to get a PS2 and start to kind of diving into the PS2 catalog and check out many games that I missed out on. Okay, so one of the most outspoken critics, even before his Munch's Odyssey project moved from PS2 to the Xbox, has been Oddworld's Inhabitants president Lorne Lanning. Intelligently designed hardware tries to consider the needs of the developer, Lanning laments. Sony's position was basically, you'll figure it out. Yeah, that's the era when Sony was like very arrogant. Like you guys figure it out. We're gonna do our own thing here, and you guys figure it out on your end. Um, Other developers agree. Some units shipped before March 1 shipped before March 1 by 1 million. Of course, much ire stems from Sony's late September announcement of a chip shortage, which caused the initial US PS2 shipment to be halved and caught publishers and retailers just as off guard as gamers. One publisher reportedly produced nearly twice as many copies of one title as there were PS2 systems in the market at launch. Even smaller companies like Working Designs felt the pains of a modest launch. President Victor Ireland explains, I wish we would have had more notice on cutting the allocation. We got it like a day before everyone else did. They reduced PS2 hardware locations if they did. No, I think I'm reading it all wrong. You know, that's another thing that's kind of a product of its time. Like I'm reading it zoomed in like this, and I'm kind of forgetting that this isn't a website. This is a gaming magazine. There's more stuff down the bottom. So I'm supposed to read it top to bottom and then go over to the side. Okay, skipped over some parts here. So other developers agree. Some even compare making games for the PS2 to developing for the notoriously difficult Sega Saturn. Publishers as well have reason to complain. Even my reading got better as I zoomed out. As companies disclose their earnings for the fiscal year, many are left trying to explain huge losses. Big names like Electronic Arts are expected to post earnings well below their initial goals, and most analysts blame lower than expected PS2 sales as a primary cause. So the PS2 was struggling with sales at first. I didn't know that. I thought it was kind of a hit from the get-go. We're not outside of the range we had planned for, but on the low end of it, we wish they had installed 50 million by Christmas, quips EA spokesperson Jeff Brown. Even Sony themselves blamed the 13 billion yen deficit on problems with the PS2 sales and has lowered its forecasts of total units shipped before March by 1 million. Of course, much ire stems from Sony's late September announcement of a chip shortage, which caused the initial US PS2 shipment to be halved and caught publishers and retailers just as off guard as gamers. And like today, we've been talking a lot about chip shortage and how this affected the PS5, but the same exact thing happened on the PS2 launch. Again, had no idea about that. That's like, as a result of me not having access to a PS2 for the entire generation, I skipped over it. I pretty much went on a blackout. I didn't keep up with gaming news from that point on until the Wii era, the Wii, the Xbox 360 era. And that was mostly because I didn't want to have hopes for having another console anytime soon. Financial situation wasn't as good as it used to be for my parents back then. So having a console at that time, during the PS2 era, was pretty much off the table. So I didn't want to keep my hopes up. So I went off, and I just didn't read anything about news for maybe 5 years. One publisher reportedly produced nearly twice as many copies of one title as there were PS2 systems in the market at launch. Even smaller companies like Working Designs felt the pangs of a modest launch. President Victor Ireland explains, I wish we would have had more notice on cutting the allocation. We got it like a day before everyone else did. They had to have known earlier than that. Many have problems with what's happened since the launch as well. Small shipments of PS2 hardware trickled out, but multiple sources claim Sony hadn't always met its 100,000 units a week promise. Another startling coincidence critics point to is the December relaunch of the PS2 in Japan. Just as the US and the European markets were starving for systems, they relaunched the PS2 in Japan? Why? Uh, like, this is kind of getting me more and more interested to read about uh, things of the time, because I didn't know that there was a chip shortage um, affecting PS2 production and consequently the sales. And I also didn't know that there was a relaunch. Sony's CEA couldn't comment on the rationale behind the Japanese relaunch, but the fact that a PS2 sells for about 100 more in Japan than in the US has led to plenty of speculation. More expensive Japan. Again, didn't know about that. EGM was also able to confirm through multiple sources that Sony CEA threatened several major video game retailers with reduced PS2 hardware locations if they didn't remove marketing materials for Microsoft Xbox from their stores. That's kind of low. Naturally, retailers complained temporarily shelving pre-order campaigns. Complied temporarily shelving pre-order campaigns. Ross Howard, president of brand marketing for specialty game stores like Baggages and GameStop, blamed Sony's shortage from prompting demand for early pre-order campaigns in the first place. We're trying to appease customers at the end of the day, regardless of what manufacturer is out there selling what product. The big PS2 shortages scared them into wanting to get on a list. Needless to say, Sony's move to discourage Xbox pre-orders, even while they were still coming up short on hardware shipments, didn't win many fans in retail. Still, the PS2 did enjoy the biggest launch of any console in US history, and the future for Sony seems bright for the foreseeable future. Gran Turismo 3 and other huge first-party titles are just around the corner, and the PS2 hardware supply seems to be finally catching up with demand. And it's not as if the development community is jumping ship en masse. With almost every major company on board and plenty of PS2 games on the way, expect more smooth sailing for the time being. But it's also important to remember that the PS2 is currently the only major system in town. Once Xbox and GameCube systems are in full swing, publishers may not be so quiet about it or loyal to Sony. Some people think there can only be one winner. Some know, a lot of people still to this day think that there can only be one console. That's why dumb console wars still exist. EA's Brown muses, we have no idea of the upper limit of what the market can support. Yeah, so there was a lot going on for the PS2 back in the day. Yeah, I might want to read up on it to catch up because it's nostalgic. I like reading on stuff from back in the day. There was a certain magic from that time that doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. Everything is too political this day. Not that things weren't political back in the day, but I think the fact that we had to wait for magazines kept us out most of these politics that we get access pretty much in real time as it happens these days regarding gaming consoles. Okay, the Game Boy Advance was about to come out. I had this semi-translucent one. My father got it. I don't remember the occasion. Didn't don't I don't think there was an occasion. Just gave it to me out of the blue. But again, years after you guys had access to it, pretty much got it on the tail end. Like I'm as I'm reading this English version of EGM, it was very much in line with how they did the magazine, the Brazilian Portuguese version of the magazine in Brazil, and it was much different because, like I said, gaming back magazines before EGM came into the market, they were mostly like, here you have a bunch of headlines. You have one, two, three headlines. And back in the day, magazines in Brazil, they had one, maybe two. Like they would have one pretty big, taken up like with big images and very little text, and a smaller snippet down at the bottom, and that was it. So we missed out on a lot of information that you guys had access to. I don't think that we would have access to this much in regards to how the PS2 was to in regards to what was going on with the PS2 back in the day. If you were on a magazine before EGM was a thing in Brazil. Smuggler's Run. I've heard about this game a lot, but I never played it. Top 20 best-selling games of December 2000. Pokemon Gold. So yeah, Pokemon was a bestseller back then. Haven't changed much. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. I played this game a lot. Driver 2. I played this game a lot too. Love both games, but I love Tony Hawk's Pro Skater more. A lot more. The first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was also one of the best-selling games. Final Fantasy IX, one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. I'm not too big in Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy IX is one of the ones that I enjoy. Onimusha. I love Japan. I've always loved Japan. And Onimusha, I remember reading reviews on magazines back in the day, and like I was very much looking forward to playing this game one day. I played bits of it on the PC, like I think 2 years ago, but I didn't get um, too into it because I don't know, different times I guess. Hajime no Ippo. There was a boxing game for the PS2 based on the anime. I don't know what this is. What is this? I don't know what this is. Previews. I love this style of ads. Holy shit. This is EB Games. It's a gaming store, right? We don't have that in Brazil, but I know that this is, or at least it used to be a pretty big gaming store chain back in the day. I love this style of ads. Like there's a certain look to this type of ads that we don't get anymore, unfortunately. Fighting Vipers 2, I remember this game. Never played, but I remember it. Shenmue 2 was the reason why. Shenmue, in fact, not 2. The first Shenmue was the reason why I wanted a Dreamcast. Again, Japan. I had a whole thing about Japan. I still do. I love Japan. I love Japanese culture, and seeing that there was a game that took place in Japan was pretty much a selling point for the console for me. But I never had a Dreamcast. I did play because a neighbor had one, but he didn't have Shenmue, so I never played Shenmue. But I do have it on PC. Maybe I should play this game one of these days. Conker's Bad Fur Day. I remember this game being a big deal because at the time Nintendo was still that family-friendly console manufacturer, and then they had pretty much a first. I don't remember if Nintendo owned Rare at some point, or I don't know, but to have Rare, who developed some of the biggest games that the Nintendo 64 had at the time, come up with Conker's Bad Fur Day, which was pretty much a game that was as far removed from being family friendly as it gets. It was kind of funny, and of course, back when I was a kid, I had no idea that this game was what it is because I didn't understand English. I just found some weird stuff like the Pooh character, like this thing right here. I didn't know what Mighty Pooh meant back in the day, but I felt that there was something that looked like poop. Uh, Never beat it. I rented it over the weekend and never got too far. Dr. Mario 64. Again, this style of ads, it's never coming back. There was an Aladdin game for the PS2. I love the Aladdin game for the Super Nintendo, but I had no idea that there was one for the PS2 as well. No, this is for the no, this is for the original PlayStation. Hang on, did I am I misremembering it? I may have had this game. I like on the Nintendo 64 era, access to games was pretty much limited to legit copies of the game pretty much. So, and since games were very expensive in Brazil, I think I didn't have more than 8 games over the course of the entire Nintendo 64 lifespan. It was only when I finally got a PS2, a PS1, like 5 or 6 years after it came out on the US, that was finally able to get a lot of games because piracy was rampant back in the day. So we would get like 3 games for $10, like converted to how much the US is valued today. $10, 10 Brazilian reais would be like $2. 3 games for $2, pretty much. So I had over 150 games by the end of my time on the PS1. And a lot of it I don't remember. I don't remember which games I had. I only remember the ones that I liked the most. Half-Life, a big deal back in the day, and still to this day as well. Resident Evil Code Veronica X. I remember that this was a Dreamcast exclusive or some. It was for the PS. Oh, it says here. Sega fanboys have one last Dreamcast exclusive to taunt PS2 owners about come this May. Yeah. So they brought over the Code Veronica. Used to be a Dreamcast exclusive. SSX, another franchise that I like. What's this? What is the Z for? Looks like Ridge Racer on the top, isn't it? Ridge Racer 6, maybe? No, Ridge Racer 5. 6 was for the Xbox 360. I would love to have this game on the PS. So I have a bunch of PS2 games that I brought from Japan, like the Gran Turismo games and a few other ones, but I never had a PS1. I bought them with the intention of buying a PS2, but I never got one. Le Mans. The weirdest ad. Time Crisis, I remember. Onimusha Warlords. That's the first one, right? Holy crap. Let me just make sure that I... Yeah, that's the Batman game for the PS1, isn't it? I have a story about this game, and my father had given me $50 to buy clothes. Like, I was young, but it was at that phase where I wanted to kind of go out on my own without having my father in tow. And he let me go to the shopping mall by myself. It was a shopping mall that was right by my grandma. And I don't remember the reason, but he gave me $50 to buy clothes. And I spent like $15 on a t-shirt at the shopping mall. And but on my way to the shopping mall, I remember that I saw a gaming store that sold pirated PS1 games. And as a kid, that was like a lot of temptation. I was a kid that didn't have my own money, and suddenly I had $50 in my pocket. So I went into the shopping mall. I got a t-shirt for $15 just so I had something to show for it. And I blew the rest of the money on games. My father was so mad at me, so mad. And I remember that I visited my grandma before going back home, and she saw me with this huge bag filled to the brim with games. Like, I had 35 bucks to spend. Like, I could get three games for 10. So I got 9 games, and then I remember that the seller let me get 3 games for 5 because I was getting a lot of games. So I ended up with 12 games, like 12 games filling a bag on top of I think was sitting underneath the t-shirt that I bought. And my grandma was curious about what was all that stuff in my bag, and I showed her all the games. My father had told her that he had given me the money to buy clothes, and she said, "You did something here, didn't you?" And she told him to not get mad at me, but my father got really mad at me. He was waiting for me outside of the apartment building because he knew that I would be coming at any time, and he wanted to confront me before I went up into the apartment. And one of the reason why I'm telling this story is that I remember that one of the games that I got, I've always loved Batman. I haven't kept up with the comics. I haven't read comics for many years now. Ever since I started working in the comic book industry as a comic book colorist, I haven't had the desire to read comics anymore. But I've always had a thing for Batman since I was a kid, and I remember that's one of the games that I got, Batman Gotham City Racer, and it's by far one of the shittiest racing games that I've ever gotten. I say racing games, it wasn't necessarily a racing games. Like, you had missions that you had to complete, and it was one of the shittiest driving that I had in any games that had vehicles in them. I might as well do a video on this game because I need to refresh my memory on how bad this game was. Battlefield 1942. This game is this old? 2000s. I don't know. I was under the impression that this game was a lot newer than this. Mario Kart Advance, that's one of the games that I had on the Advance. Mr. Driller 2, I didn't know what that was about back in the day. These days, I love the series. I kind of got into the series recently actually. F-Zero Advance, I remember that I had this game and I was pretty disappointed to find out that this was pretty much a port of the Super Nintendo game. I don't remember if it was a straight port, but that was the impression that I got as a kid because it was very similar to the game that I had on the Super Nintendo. Tactics Ogre Gaiden. I didn't have this one on the GBA, but I had this on the PS1, the Tactics Ogre. Earthworm Jim, I had it on the Super Nintendo. Didn't like it. Pitfall, I also had it. Nintendo 64, $99.99. That's, I don't know how much that would be if you factor inflation, but that seems very cheap. Especially when you consider that the console costs literally almost just over twice the price of a game, and in some cases less than twice. So yeah, that was very cheap. I had this translucent blue one that I didn't know. I was watching Scott the Wall's video these days when he mentioned that these translucent Nintendo 64s, they were special editions. I didn't know that there was a thing. I just thought that there were different colorways. Didn't know that. But I love the look of my Nintendo 64. As much as I didn't like the Nintendo 64, it's one of my least favorite consoles that I've ever owned. But I have a lot of fond memories because of the look of the console. And what games do I have here? Oh, Mickey Speedway USA. I had this game on the Nintendo 64. I remember. I went into a used game store and my mother got it for me. Perfect Dark. Played this a crap ton of Perfect Dark back in the day with my best friend. Crazy Taxi. I played a lot of this game. That's one of the games that my neighbor had. My neighbor next door. Metropolis Street Racer was a game that I always wanted to play, never played back in the day, but I did play, and I did a live stream on the channel, I think last year or 2 years ago. Might as well play it through the end because I enjoyed what I played so far. The Dreamcast was also $99.99. Third-party controllers. Fanavision. They re-released this game, right? For the PSVR 2 these days. Memory cards were very expensive. Holy crap, almost the price of a game. 35 bucks. Zone of the Enders. I remember this being a big deal back in the day. I think Kojima did this game or was involved with it. That's why it was a big deal. Oh, now for the feature of this issue, Gran Turismo 3. I said I was gonna tell the story on a separate video, but this video is already a lot longer than I anticipated. So, what the heck? So when I got the PS2, I had the GameCube. Again, I was tied to legit copies because there wasn't pirated copies of GameCube games back in the day, and GameCube games were really expensive in Brazil. Like, and just so you have an idea, back in the day when I had the SNES, before I don't even know if the term was jailbreak back in the day. But before I had someone do something to my SNES to allow me to play pirated copies, a single SNES game would cost almost half a month's worth salary, minimum wage salary in Brazil. So when my father wanted to give me a game for the SNES, he had to literally pay it in 12 installments for a year. And it wasn't until piracy became viable that I was able to afford to buy a lot more games. And it was the same thing with the GameCube. But the thing is that piracy was never a thing on the GameCube. And so games were very expensive, and because of that, because there wasn't piracy to compete with, and games cost an arm and a leg, rental stores would rent for a lot. They would charge like $15. That was the price. That was the cost of 7 or 8 PS1 games, pirated copies of PS1 games for one game for one day. It didn't matter if you were renting over the weekend. If you were renting on Saturday, for example, that didn't open on Sundays, you will have to pay twice because you would be forced to have the game for an extra day, and the store didn't budge on it. So you had to pay $30 for a single game rental. So I figure, okay, so there are a lot of games that I want to play on the PS2. I'm kind of limited to what I can play, limited on what I can play on the GameCube. Even though the GameCube was my favorite game console ever. There isn't a single game console that I loved more than the GameCube. But I wanted to play more games. As a kid, you want to have access to a lot of games. So what I did was I sold my GameCube for just enough, my GameCube and games for just enough to be able to afford a PS2 and maybe a couple of pirated games. Problem is, back in the day, the mod chips that they had on the PS2, they were known to have a lot of issues. They aren't as stable as the stuff that we have now for the PS2. And I remember that I got one of the early mod chips for the PS2 that was known to have a ton of issues, and I didn't know back in the day because, again, access to information back in the day in Brazil was very limited. So I wasn't aware of any of that. What I'm telling you right now is in retrospect with the information that I have now. Back in the day, I didn't have any idea that the mod chips were buggy. And what ended up happening is that I got a PS2 with 10 games. I remember that Gran Turismo 3 was one of the games, in Final Fantasy. I remember 4 of the 10 games, 5 of the 10 games. I got Onimusha 3, I think was the third one. Devil May Cry, I think was Devil May Cry 3 as well that I got. I got Gran Turismo 3, Final Fantasy 10, and Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. Tony Hawk American Wasteland, I hated it, didn't like it, barely played it. Final Fantasy 10, you wouldn't play past the first cutscene. Every time that he got into the first cutscene, it would crash. Not crash, it would pretty much freeze the entire console. Onimusha, same thing. As soon as I got in the first combat, the console froze. Devil May Cry wouldn't even boot. And I think my biggest frustration was Gran Turismo, because that was the game that I loved immediately. Out of all of the games that I got with the PS2, Gran Turismo was the one that I was looking for the most to play, the Gran Turismo 3, the one that we're seeing in the magazine. And this thing would freeze every time I would start a race. It wasn't as consistent as the other games would freeze, but I would drive maybe the first 1 or 2 laps, it would crash, it would freeze. I wouldn't be able to play a single game. I've never played an entire race in Gran Turismo 3, to be honest. And I was so disappointed. I was so heartbroken over having sold my favorite gaming console because I wanted to have access to more games, that I ended up just selling it for little to nothing, close to nothing for an acquaintance that I had back in the day. Because I was frustrated. He said that he was gonna look into getting it fixed, so I sold him for very cheap. And that's how I spent the next 5 years without a gaming console, because the GameCube was the only gaming console that I had. I had sold the other consoles that I had. I sold my Game Boy Advance, my Super Nintendo, my Nintendo 64, just so that I could afford to buy games for the GameCube. And I was so disappointed that I got rid of all of that for a console that pretty much never worked for me. And I spent the next 5 years without playing any games for that matter. And that's how I skipped over the entire PS2 generation. But that's a generation that I still have a lot of nostalgia for, even though I never played any games pretty much of that console. I have a lot of nostalgia because of the time that those games were coming out. I'm not gonna read this on this video because this video is almost an hour long already. um, I'm not gonna edit this video. I'm gonna upload it as it is. As I said, I'm gonna do this thing off the cuff, no edits, because I'm not in the right mindset to plan videos at this moment. But I'm enjoying doing this a lot more than scripted videos. So that's been fun. Motor Tune Grand Prix. I remember that. I think this is the first Polyphony Digital's game, right? That's the game that they did before they did Gran Turismo, the first one for the PS1. The wheel. But yeah, a lot of stuff I missed out on in this generation. EGM's 2000 Gamers Choice Awards. Dreamcast Game of the Year, NFL 2K1. Okay? I'm not going to be one of those people who's going to look down on people who enjoy sports game, because I see a ton of people looking down on people who enjoy racing games, and every time that any racing game gets to the top of any list, people roll their eyes because another racing game, it's not an RPG. I guess the same argument could be made to with pretty much every single gaming genre there is, but that's besides the point. Jet Grind Radio, never played it. Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. I hated this game back when I was a kid. I rented it on the weekend, didn't like it. I played it for maybe half an hour, didn't touch this game until it was time to return it to the store. Capcom vs SNK. I think there was a port for the PS1 because I remember having this game, and I liked it. I've always sucked at fighting games, but I enjoyed them back when I was a kid. These days I still enjoy them, but I just don't have the patience to commit the time that it takes to learn to play them properly. Jet Set Radio is one of my favorite games coming from the Dreamcast era, but I never played Jet Grind Radio. Skies of Arcadia. I remember this game being a big deal. Not back in the day, but more recently. Final Fantasy IX. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Wholeheartedly agree with this one to be on top of a list. What is this? Oh, this is an arcade stick for the Dreamcast? Yeah. So they had a bunch of short reviews. That wasn't a thing in Brazilian magazines. Again, that only became a thing after EGM became a thing in Brazil. And I say this, of course, I didn't read every single magazine there was in Brazil, but I read most of them. I bought most of them, and I don't remember this being a thing, like multiple reviews in a single issues like we have here. Metal Slug X, love this game. Racing. Is this the literal name of the game? Racing. Are you fucking kidding me? That's that's like releasing a Resident Evil as zombie. That's so stupid. F1 Racing Championship for the PS2, Knockout Kings, Onimusha Warlords, Mega Man Extreme, for the Game Boy Color, Looney Tunes Racing for the Game Boy Color, the usual cheats. I loved buying magazines for the cheats. I've always enjoyed cheats that modify the game more than so the actual cheats to help you cheat with the game. Like who here remembers the dog code for the International Superstar Soccer Deluxe for the Super Nintendo, the Konami code, right? I remember I love cheat codes like that. Tomb Raider Chronicles, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, 007 Racing. Didn't know this there was a racing game. I'm curious to check this one out though for the PS1. I'm gonna remember that. Mega Man X5. I love the Mega Man X4 for the PS1. I played that game a lot with my friend, my best friend. Powerpuff Girls. Um, I know none of you care, but I did a couple. I colored a couple Powerpuff Girls comic book adaptation, couple of issues, a few years ago. Might put it up on the screen if I remember. If I don't remember that, that's fine. I don't think anyone's gonna care. Um, Daytona USA Network Racing. That's an online version for the Dreamcast. Oh, that's cool. They had previews for what was coming up next for the next issue. That wasn't a thing in Brazilian magazines like at all. That's why I said that there was an element of surprise back in the day because we didn't have previews for the next month's issue. That was a good time. Like that's a time that's never coming back because times change, things move forward, and a lot of the nostalgia is like looking at it with rose tinted glasses. But even still, even in saying this, I still think that there was something magical about the time, about how we consumed gaming media that just doesn't exist anymore. Everything's so cut and dry these days that um, I don't know. It's something that I appreciate out of that specific time in gaming. But I'm gonna be doing more of these videos because I enjoyed it a lot. I'm gonna grab random issues and just go over the entire thing. And but yeah, that's it. Hope you enjoy it. If you enjoyed, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all in my next video.